The sun was setting over the city of Obiala, casting long shadows across the crowded marketplace. People were bustling about, bargaining for the last of the day's goods. In the middle of this chaos, Chibueze, the mad beggar, moved like a shadow, his ragged clothes and wild hair blending him into the background. No one noticed him, and that's exactly how he wanted it. But today, something felt off. Chibueze's eyes scanned the crowd, his gaze locking onto a group of children playing near the fruit stalls. They laughed and chased each other, their carefree joy echoing through the market. One little boy, Amara, stood out. He was running around, his laughter the loudest of them all. But Chibueze wasn't smiling. His heart pounded in his chest, not from excitement but from fear. He had been watching Amara for a while, waiting for the right moment to act. But now, as he saw the boy dart away from his mother's side, his stomach twisted. Amara's mother was busy haggling with a customer, not noticing her son had wandered off. Chibueze was about to make his move, to take this chance. Then suddenly, a woman's scream pierced the air. "Amara, where are you?" Amara's mother turned around, her eyes wide with panic. The market seemed to freeze for a moment as everyone turned to look. Chibueze stiffened, his heart pounding as he watched the scene unfold. His body tensed, ready to run, ready to grab Amara and disappear into the maze of alleyways he knew so well. But then Amara appeared, running back to his mother, giggling. "Mama, I was just playing," he said, his voice innocent and sweet. His mother dropped to her knees, hugging him tightly, relief on her face. The crowd sighed and began to move again, the moment of panic fading away. Chibueze stood still, his fists clenched at his sides. The chance had been there, right in front of him, and he had hesitated. He felt a strange mix of anger and relief washing over him. He knew he couldn't afford to make mistakes, couldn't afford to be seen. But something about that scream, the look on the mother's face, had frozen him in place. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had to stay focused. The syndicate was waiting, and they wouldn't be patient forever. He turned and slipped away from the market, his heart still pounding. Today wasn't the day. But soon, very soon, he would have to make his move. And he couldn't afford to fail. The next morning, as the sun shone brightly over Obiala, its warm rays making the busy streets come alive with people and laughter. Children ran around, their joyful voices filling the air as they played in the street. Among them was Adaora, a little girl with a big smile and bright eyes. She wore a colourful dress and her laughter was like music. Adaora was playing with other children, hopping and skipping. But then something caught her eye, a beautiful yellow butterfly fluttering by. She gasped with delight and, without thinking, began to chase the butterfly, her tiny feet pattering on the dusty ground. The butterfly led her away from the busy market, around a quiet corner where the noise of the crowd faded away. Adaora didn't notice that she was getting farther from the other children and from her mother, who was busy talking to a shopkeeper. Chibueze, the mad beggar, had been watching. He saw Adaora run around the corner, her eyes fixed on the butterfly. His heart raced. This was his chance. He glanced around, making sure no one was looking. Everyone was busy with their own business. He moved closer, his ragged clothes and wild hair blending into the background. No one paid him any attention. Adaora giggled as she jumped up, trying to catch the butterfly. She didn't see Chibueze coming up behind her. In one swift move, Chibueze reached out and covered her mouth with his hand. Adaora's eyes widened with fear. She tried to scream, but the sound was muffled. She kicked and struggled, but Chibueze was strong. He lifted her up quickly and carried her into a small dark alley nearby. Adaora tried to scream again, her heart pounding with fear. But Chibueze held her tightly, whispering, "Be quiet, little one." His voice was cold and calm. Adaora's small body shook with silent sobs as she realized she was being taken away from her mother, from the safety of the bright sunny street. People walked by the entrance of the alley, but no one noticed the mad beggar and the little girl he now carried on his shoulder in a very big sack. Chibueze moved swiftly, his heart beating fast. He knew he had to get away before anyone realized what had happened. He made his way through the narrow streets of Obiala, avoiding the crowded areas and sticking to the quieter paths. By the time Adaora's mother noticed she was gone, it was too late. She called out, her voice filled with panic, "Adaora! Adaora!" But there was no answer. The city's people looked around trying to help, but there was no trace of the little girl. Chibueze had disappeared with her, slipping through the city like a shadow. He carried Adaora through the winding streets, moving quickly. She was scared and silent now, her tiny body trembling. Chibueze's face was set and determined. He knew exactly where to go. He headed towards an old abandoned building on the edge of the city. It looked empty and forgotten, but Chibueze knew that inside it was a different world. He reached the door and knocked 3 times, then twice more. The door creaked open, and a tall man with a big scar on his face looked down at Chibueze. His name was Chinedu, and he was part of a dangerous group of people. He looked at Adaora and then back at Chibueze, his eyes narrowing. "Good job, Chibueze," Chinedu said, looking at the frightened girl in Chibueze's arms. Adaora's eyes were wide with fear, and she whimpered softly. Chinedu didn't care. He pulled her away from Chibueze and handed him a bag full of money. "You know what to do next," Chinedu said. Chibueze nodded, feeling the weight of the money in his hand. He turned to leave, but he glanced back at Adaora. She was crying softly. Chibueze felt a strange feeling in his chest, like a stone pressing down. But he shook it off. He had to stay strong. He had to keep doing his job. As Chibueze walked back to the city, he thought about Chinedu's warning. "We need more children," Chinedu had said, "and you must not be caught." Chibueze knew that if he made a mistake, it would be the end for him. The syndicate was powerful and ruthless. They took children and sold them to people in faraway places. Chibueze didn't want to think about what happened to the children after he left them with Chinedu. He tried to push those thoughts away as he returned to the city, blending back into the crowd as the mad beggar once more. The next day, Chibueze was back on the streets of Obiala, playing his role as the crazy beggar. He limped along, talking to himself and shaking his head like a madman. People avoided him, giving him a wide berth. They didn't know that behind those wild eyes, Chibueze was thinking carefully. He was planning his next move. He needed to find another child, but he had to be careful. He couldn't take too many from the same place, or people would get suspicious. Chibueze wandered along the busy streets, his eyes scanning the children playing and moving about. He spotted a young boy, around 7 years old, with a big smile and bright eyes standing by a small shop. The boy, carrying a small polythene bag, was being handed some money and a note by an adult, who seemed to be sending him on an errand. The boy nodded eagerly, then waved goodbye to his friends as he set off down the street, his small feet moving quickly along the pavement. Chibueze followed from a distance, his movements erratic and aimless, muttering to himself and shaking his head like a madman, blending into the background. As the boy turned a corner onto a quieter street, his friends no longer in sight, Chibueze saw his chance. He shuffled closer, pretending to stumble and fall near the boy. The child paused, looking at him with a mix of curiosity and fear. Chibueze, still on the ground, looked up at him, his expression pained and helpless, hoping to draw the boy closer. "Help me, boy," Chibueze said in a shaky voice, holding out his hand. Tunde hesitated, then took a step forward. That was all Chibueze needed. He grabbed Tunde's arm and pulled him close. Tunde tried to scream, but Chibueze covered his mouth and whispered, "Don't make a sound." The boy's eyes widened in terror as Chibueze picked him up and carried him away. It was night by the time Chibueze reached the abandoned building again. This time, Chinedu was waiting outside. He looked angry. "You took too long," he said, grabbing Tunde roughly. The boy was trembling, tears streaming down his face. Chibueze didn't say anything. He knew better than to argue with Chinedu. He handed over the boy and watched as Chinedu dragged him inside. Chibueze felt a chill run down his spine. He wanted to turn and leave, but Chinedu blocked his path. "You need to be faster, Chibueze," Chinedu growled. "The police will start to notice, so be careful. We can't afford any mistakes." Chibueze nodded, feeling the fear rise inside him. He knew that if he got caught, Chinedu and the syndicate wouldn't protect him. He was on his own. Chinedu handed him another bag of money and pushed him out the door. "We need another child, and soon," he said. "Don't fail us." Chibueze walked away, his mind racing. The weight of the money felt heavy in his hand, and so did the guilt in his heart. He tried not to think about the children he had taken, about what would happen to them, but the thoughts kept coming, like dark clouds filling his mind. He shook his head and mumbled to himself, trying to silence them. He needed to stay focused. He needed to find another child, quickly. He had no choice. Chibueze spent the next few days wandering through different parts of Obiala. He didn't want to take too many children from the same area. He knew he had to be smart. He visited markets, parks, and even small villages on the outskirts of the city. He watched the children play, looking for the right moment. But now, something felt different. People were starting to notice the missing children. Parents were holding their children closer, and the street seemed more guarded. One afternoon, Chibueze saw a girl named Zuri. She was about 7 years old, with long braids and a bright red dress. She was playing with a stick, drawing in the dirt while her grandmother sold vegetables nearby. Chibueze watched her for a long time. He knew he had to be quick. He waited until the grandmother was busy with a customer. Then he made his move. He walked up to Zuri, pretending to stumble and fall in front of her. "Please help me," he muttered, reaching out his hand. Zuri hesitated, then stepped closer. But before Chibueze could grab her, the grandmother looked up and saw him. "Get away from her!" she shouted. Chibueze felt a jolt of fear. He turned and ran, disappearing into the crowd. His heart was pounding as he ducked into an alley. That was too close. He knew he couldn't make any more mistakes. He needed to be even more careful. The people of Obiala were starting to get suspicious, and the syndicate would not tolerate failure. The next day, Chinedu called Chibueze to meet him in a dark alley. Chinedu's face was filled with anger. "You almost got caught," he shouted. Chibueze tried to explain, but Chinedu didn't listen. "The police are getting closer because of your mistakes. If you mess up again, it will be the end of you." Chibueze felt his heart sink. He knew that Chinedu was serious. The syndicate was powerful and dangerous. If they decided he was a problem, they would not hesitate to get rid of him. Chinedu grabbed Chibueze's arm and pulled him closer. "We have a new order," he said, his voice low and threatening. "We need a special child. Her father is a rich man in city. If we get her, we will make a lot of money." Chibueze's eyes widened. This was risky. The rich man had guards, and the city would go crazy if his daughter went missing, but he knew he couldn't refuse. Chinedu looked at him with cold eyes. "You do this, or you're finished." Chibueze nodded slowly. He knew he had no choice. He had to find a way to take this girl, or he would lose everything. He felt trapped, like a lion in a cage. He walked away from Chinedu, his mind racing. He had to come up with a plan, but he didn't know if he could do it. The stakes were higher than ever, and one mistake could cost him his life. Chibueze knew he was running out of time. Chibueze spent days watching the rich man's house. The girl's name was Kemi. She was about 8 years old, with big, curious eyes and a smile that made everyone around her happy. She was always surrounded by guards. Chibueze knew this would be his hardest job yet. He had to be very careful. He disguised himself as the madman, just as he always did, and wandered near the house. He spent his days loitering around, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to act. One afternoon, Chibueze saw his chance. Kemi was playing alone in the garden, picking flowers. The guards were close by but not paying attention. Chibueze pretended to fall and hurt his leg near the garden gate. He cried out in pain, holding his leg. Kemi heard him and ran over. "Are you okay, sir?" she asked, her voice full of concern. Chibueze nodded, pretending to be in pain. "Please help me," he said, reaching out to her. Kemi looked around, then opened the gate and stepped outside. Chibueze moved quickly. He grabbed her and covered her mouth. She struggled, but Chibueze was strong. He picked her up and ran. The guards heard the noise and turned around. They saw Chibueze running with Kemi and shouted, but it was too late. Chibueze knew the secret ways of Obiala, and he disappeared into the maze of alleys and side streets. He had done it, but he knew this was only the beginning of a very dangerous game. Chibueze reached the meeting place with Kemi, but he knew something was wrong. Chinedu was furious. "You were seen!" he shouted. "Now everyone in Obiala is looking for you." Chibueze felt his heart pound. This was bad. The whole city would be searching for Kemi, and if they found out it was him, the syndicate would be exposed. Chinedu grabbed Chibueze by the collar and pulled him close. "You've put us all in danger," he hissed. "If you get caught, you will not survive." Chibueze knew Chinedu was serious. He felt fear like he had never felt before. He had to be more careful than ever. But now, he had to deal with Kemi. She was crying, her face pale with fear. Chibueze tried to calm her down, but she kept asking for her parents. "I want to go home," she sobbed. Chibueze felt a pang of guilt, but he pushed it away. He couldn't let his emotions get in the way. Chinedu told Chibueze to take Kemi to a different place, far from city. "Her family will pay a high price to get her back," Chinedu said, his voice cold and calculating. Chibueze nodded, feeling trapped. He knew he had to do what Chinedu said, but he also knew the police were getting closer. He took Kemi to a small house outside Obiala, hiding her there while he tried to come up with a plan. He was in deeper than ever, and he didn't know if he could get out. Days passed, and Chibueze's mind was a mess. He felt trapped in a nightmare. The police were everywhere searching for Kemi. People were talking about the madman who took children. The city was filled with fear and anger. Chibueze knew he had to be careful, but he also knew he couldn't stop. The syndicate would kill him if he didn't deliver Kemi. He felt like he was drowning with no way out. Chibueze sat in his hideout, the small room dimly lit by a single bulb. His heart pounded as he listened to the radio. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. He picked it up with shaking hands and listened to the voice on the other end. It was his contact, speaking in a tense whisper. "They're everywhere, Chibueze. The police are looking for the girl. Her parents are offering a huge reward. You need to be careful." Kemi's parents were pleading for their child's safe return. Their voices trembled with fear and desperation. As Chibueze listened, something broke inside him. He remembered his own daughter Nkem, who had died many years ago. Back then, Chibueze had been a hard-working man with a loving family. But when Nkem fell sick, he didn't have the money for the treatment she needed. He begged and borrowed, but it wasn't enough. She died in his arms, her small body weak and frail. The grief destroyed him. He lost his job, his home, and eventually, his relationship. In his despair, the syndicate found him. They offered him money he no longer needed but couldn't refuse. At first he told himself it was just a way to survive, to numb the pain. But as time passed, he became numb to the suffering he caused. He had lost everything then, and now he was taking everything from others. The man who once cherished his own child had become a monster, and it was too late to change anything. He was too far gone. Sitting in this dimly lit hideout, Chibueze stared at the cracked walls around him. The small room was cluttered with old boxes and worn-out furniture, a far cry from the life he had once known. His phone buzzed loudly, breaking the silence. It was Chinedu calling him again, his voice cold and angry. "You need to be ready," he said. "We will take Kemi soon. If you make any mistakes, you're dead." Chibueze knew he had no choice. He had to follow orders. Later that night, as Chibueze sat in the dark silence of his hideout, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from a contact within the syndicate, someone who had always looked out for him from the shadows. The message was short but chilling. "I overheard Chinedu talking. They don't trust you anymore. They think you're too risky. They're planning to get rid of you." Chibueze's heart stopped. His hand shook as he read the words again, disbelief washing over him. He knew too much, and now he had become a problem for them. Panic set in as the reality of the situation hit him. He wasn't just in danger from the police. The syndicate itself wanted him gone. His mind raced. He looked over at Kemi, who was curled up, sleeping fitfully. He had taken her, hoping it would buy him more time, but now he realized it had only made things worse. The syndicate didn't need him anymore, and with the girl in his possession, he was more of a liability than ever. Chibueze felt trapped, like a cornered animal. He had to act fast, but he didn't know what to do. If he ran, they would find him. If he stayed, they would kill him. His breaths came faster as fear gripped him. He needed a plan, but all he had was a sinking feeling that his time was running out. He looked at Kemi, who was sleeping on the floor. He felt a strange feeling in his chest, like he needed to protect her. He didn't know why, but he knew he couldn't let the syndicate take her. He decided to make a plan. He would take Kemi and run. He didn't know where they would go, but he knew he had to try. It was his only chance. Chibueze packed a small bag with some food and water. He gently woke Kemi and told her they were leaving. She looked at him with scared eyes but didn't say anything. Chibueze picked her up and carried her out of the house. He knew it was dangerous, but he also knew he couldn't stay. He had to escape before Chinedu and his men came for him. It was his last hope. Chibueze carried Kemi through the dark streets of Obiala, moving quickly and quietly. He knew he had to get out of city before the syndicate found out he was gone. He thought about going to the police, but he knew they wouldn't believe him. He was just the mad beggar to them. They would think he was lying, or worse, they would arrest him. He had to find another way. As he walked, he saw a little boy named Oluwatobi playing outside his house. Oluwatobi was alone, and Chibueze felt a strange sense of hope. Maybe he could use Oluwatobi to buy his freedom. If he took Oluwatobi and gave him to the syndicate, they might let him go. But then he looked at Kemi holding her close. She was shaking with fear. Chibueze knew he couldn't do it. He couldn't take another child. He had to end this. Chibueze kept walking, holding Kemi tight. He decided to go to the old abandoned warehouse on the edge of city. It was a risky move, but he knew it was his only chance. He had to face Chinedu and the syndicate. He had to try and make them let him go. He knew it was dangerous, but he had no other choice. He felt like he was running out of time. Chibueze arrived at the abandoned warehouse with Kemi. He felt a cold sweat on his forehead as he saw Chinedu and his men waiting. Chinedu's face was dark with anger. "What are you doing here, Chibueze?" he demanded. Chibueze held Kemi close and took a deep breath. "I want to make a deal," he said. Chinedu laughed, but there was no humor in his eyes. "You have nothing to offer us," he said. "You are finished." Chibueze felt panic rise inside him. He knew this was a trap, but he had to try. "I will give you Kemi," he said, his voice shaking. "Just let me go." Chinedu looked at him, his eyes cold and hard. "You think we need you," he said. "You are nothing to us." He nodded to his men and they started to move forward. Chibueze felt his heart race. He knew he was in big trouble. He looked around, searching for a way out. But then he heard something, the sound of sirens in the distance. Chinedu's men froze, looking around in confusion. Chibueze felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could escape. He tightened his grip on Kemi, who was trembling in his arms, and began to back away slowly, his eyes never leaving Chinedu. "You think the police will help you?" Chinedu sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're a dead man, Chibueze." But Chibueze didn't care anymore. His heart pounded with a mix of fear and determination. The sirens were getting closer, the red and blue lights flickering in the distance. He knew this was his only chance. Without another thought, he spun around and bolted, clutching Kemi tightly against his chest. Shouts erupted behind him as Chinedu's men realized what was happening. They gave chase, their footsteps pounding against the ground. Chibueze's lungs burned as he ran through the dark alleys, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. He glanced back and saw the men gaining on him, but the sirens were deafening now, almost upon them. Chibueze turned sharply down a narrow path he knew well, the kind of place only someone who had lived on these streets would know. He ducked through a small gap in a crumbling wall, slipping into a maze of old buildings. He could hear the men shouting, their voices angry and desperate, but the wailing sirens drowned them out. He kept running, his breath coming in ragged gasps, until he reached a hidden doorway. He kicked it open and stumbled inside, pulling the door shut behind him. He held his breath, listening as Chinedu's men ran past, their footsteps fading into the night. Chibueze sank to the ground, clutching Kemi to his chest. His body was shaking, his heart racing, but he was safe for now. He knew this was only a temporary reprieve. They would be looking for him, and the police would soon flood the area. But for the moment he had escaped. He held Kemi closer, feeling her small, terrified breaths against his chest, and whispered, "It's going to be okay." Even though he wasn't sure if it was true. Chibueze and Kemi were hiding in an old shed on the outskirts of city. He could hear the sirens and the sounds of people shouting. He knew they were looking for him. He held Kemi close, feeling her small body trembling. He didn't know what to do. He was trapped. If he stayed, the syndicate would find him. If he left, the police would catch him. He felt like a cornered animal, with no way out. Kemi looked up at him with tear-filled eyes. "Are you going to hurt me?" she whispered. Chibueze felt his heart break. He shook his head. "No, I promise I won't hurt you," he said softly. He knew he had to protect her, but he didn't know how. He was scared, more scared than he had ever been. He didn't know what would happen next. All he knew was that he had to keep moving. He couldn't let them find him. He had to find a way out. The city of Obiala was in chaos. News of the high-profile abduction had spread like wildfire. People were scared and angry. The police were everywhere, searching for Kemi. They questioned everyone, but no one had seen anything. The city's people were on edge, afraid to let their children out of their sight. Everyone was talking about the madman who took children. Detective Amara stepped off the bus in Obiala, the hot afternoon sun beating down on the dusty streets. The city buzzed with an uneasy energy. People moved quickly, eyes down, and voices hushed. News of Kemi's abduction had spread like wildfire, and fear gripped every corner of the city. Amara could sense it in the tightness of the people's shoulders, in the way parents held their children close. This was a city on the edge, and she had been sent to bring it back from the brink. Her mission was clear but perilous: infiltrate the city, investigate the recent kidnappings, and expose the powerful syndicate responsible. But there was a warning too: trust no one. The syndicate's reach was long, and even those in the police force and city leadership were rumoured to be involved. She had to move carefully, stay under the radar, and find the truth without drawing too much attention to herself. Under the guise of a social worker, Amara rented a small nondescript room on the outskirts of the city. It was cramped and sparsely furnished, but it gave her a vantage point to observe without being noticed. She spent the first few days blending in, visiting families, and gathering information about the missing children. The fear in their eyes and the helplessness in their voices only strengthened her resolve to bring the culprits to justice. One evening, while she was reviewing her notes, she received a call from an unexpected source. It was from an old friend, Ayo, a journalist who had once helped her with another case. He had been investigating the syndicate for months, trying to piece together the puzzle of their operations in Obiala. They hadn't spoken in years, and she was surprised to hear from him. "Amara, I've been following the trail of these kidnappings," Ayo said, his voice tense. "I've got something, but I can't report it. It's too dangerous. You're in Obiala now, right?" "Yes, I'm here," Amara replied, her pulse quickening. "What do you have?" "There's a place," Ayo said quietly. "An old quarry near the outskirts of city. I've heard whispers that the madman, Chibueze, has been seen there with the girl. I don't know what he's planning, but it's big. The syndicate is moving in tonight. They want to silence him." Amara felt a chill run down her spine. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be without getting myself killed," Ayo answered. "But listen, Amara, the syndicate is onto you. They know there's someone new in city asking questions. Be careful. Don't go alone. This isn't just about saving the girl anymore. It's about survival." The line went dead, leaving Amara with a heavy sense of urgency. She knew Ayo wouldn't have called if he wasn't certain. The old quarry. It was a risky move, but she had no choice. She had to find Chibueze and Kemi before the syndicate did. She quickly gathered her things and slipped out of her room, moving through the narrow alleys with purpose. As she neared the outskirts, the city grew quieter, more deserted. The path to the quarry was dark and overgrown, almost forgotten. Her heart pounded as she navigated the uneven ground, every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig making her jump. When she finally reached the edge of the quarry, she crouched behind a thick bush, her eyes scanning the area. In the dim light, she saw a faint glow coming from a small campfire in the distance. She squinted, making out the shape of a man hunched over by the fire, Chibueze, and beside him, the small, trembling figure of Kemi. Relief and fear crashed over her. She had found them. But just as she was about to move closer, she noticed something else. A group of men, dressed in dark clothes, were creeping towards the quarry from the opposite side. Her heart sank. It was the syndicate, and they were closing in on Chibueze and Kemi. She had to think fast. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a message from her contact at the state police. "Amara, leave now. The syndicate knows you're in city. They're planning something dangerous. Don't get caught." She clenched her jaw, her mind racing. She couldn't just leave. But she couldn't confront them either, not without risking Kemi's life. She watched helplessly as the men surrounded the area, their guns drawn, their intentions clear. Amara felt trapped, frustration and fear clawing at her. She knew she couldn't wait much longer. She had to get help, but how? Then an idea struck her. She pulled out her phone and quickly typed a message to Ayo. "Need a distraction at the quarry. Can you make some noise in city?" Seconds later, Ayo's reply came, "Give me 5 minutes." Amara's heart pounded as she watched the men inch closer to Chibueze and Kemi. She had to buy some time and had to keep them safe until Ayo could create the diversion. She took a deep breath, her hand steady as she aimed her phone's camera at the scene, capturing everything: the men, their guns, the fear in Chibueze's eyes. Then, just as the men were about to strike, a loud explosion echoed from the direction of the city, followed by the blare of sirens and the frantic shouts of people. The syndicate members froze, their heads snapping towards the noise. Amara held her breath, her heart hammering in her chest. The men hesitated, exchanging confused glances. Finally, the leader cursed under his breath. "Let's go. We'll deal with this later." One by one they retreated, their dark figures melting into the night. Amara watched them go, relief flooding through her. She turned her gaze back to the quarry, where Chibueze still sat by the fire, oblivious to the danger that had almost claimed them. She knew she couldn't approach him now. The risk was too high. But she also knew that she had the evidence she needed to take this fight to the next level. She quickly sent the video to her contact at the state police, along with a message. "I found them. Send backup. This isn't over." With one last look at the quarry, Amara disappeared into the shadows, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. She had made her first move, but the game was far from over. The syndicate would be back, and next time they wouldn't leave empty-handed. This was only the beginning.